I was locked out of my own house. No warning. No argument. Just a changed lock and a door that wouldn't open. I stood there, holding the same keys I'd used for decades, trying to understand how a home I paid for could suddenly refuse me entry. What hurt most wasn't the cold air or the waiting. It was realizing the people inside weren't strangers. They were my children. People think betrayal comes loudly. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in words like help and family. And long before the door was locked, I had already been disappearing inside my own life. My name is Helen Brooks. I'm 72 years old, and for a long time, I thought I had done everything right. Before my life changed, I was independent, active, and proud of the life I had built. I spent over 3 decades working as a district operations supervisor for a national retail company based in New Haven, Connecticut. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable. I had stability. I had dignity. My husband, Edward, passed away several years earlier. Losing him was devastating, but I survived it. I learned how to live alone, how to manage the house, the finances, and my future. Most importantly, I had my children. My son Daniel, then in his early 40s, and my daughter Laura, a few years younger, were both living with their families in the house Edward and I bought back in the late 1980s. It was a 4-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood fully paid off long ago. At the time, it felt right. They said it would be temporary. Just until things settled. Just until they saved enough to move out. Then, in 2011, everything changed. It happened on a winter morning. Black ice on the highway. My car spun, hit the barrier, and in a matter of seconds, my independence disappeared. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctors spoke gently, carefully choosing their words. Permanent mobility issues. Long-term rehabilitation. A wheelchair at least part of the time. I remember staring at the ceiling, thinking not about pain, but about how my life would have to shrink. Daniel visited once that first week. Laura came twice. They both said the same thing. "Don't worry, Mom. We've got you. Family takes care of each other." I believed them. Rehabilitation was exhausting, months of physical therapy, learning how to navigate a world that suddenly felt full of obstacles. But I was determined to remain independent. The insurance settlement helped. Enough to modify the house. Ramps. Wider doorways. An accessible bathroom. Enough to live comfortably if I was careful. What I didn't realize then was that while I was learning how to adapt, my children were quietly adjusting their expectations too. And not in the way I imagined. At first, nothing seemed wrong. But that was only because I didn't know what to look for yet. When I finally returned home from rehabilitation, the house looked the same. But it didn't feel the same. Daniel and Laura had reorganized things to make it easier for everyone. Furniture had been moved. Cabinets rearranged. My bedroom, once my private space, now doubled as a storage room for boxes that didn't belong to me. I told myself it was temporary. They were helping. They were busy. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I began contributing financially again as soon as I could. My pension checks and savings covered utilities, groceries, property taxes, everything I'd always paid for. I even continued paying the mortgage-style home equity loan I'd taken years earlier for renovations, though the house itself had long been in my name. At first, Daniel insisted on handling the bills so I wouldn't have to worry. He started asking me to sign papers I didn't fully understand. "Just routine," he said. "Insurance stuff." When I asked questions, his tone changed. "Mom, don't stress yourself," he said. "This is why we're here." Laura echoed him. "You should focus on your health," she added. "We'll take care of the rest." Slowly, decisions stopped being mine. They discussed household matters without me. They scheduled contractors without asking. They talked about the house as if it belonged to them, what room would be whose, what changes we should make. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel telling a neighbor, "We're basically managing the place now." I reminded him gently that the house was still legally mine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course it is," he said. "We're just looking out for you." That phrase came up often after that. Looking out for you. It was used when they took my checkbook for safekeeping. When they suggested I stop driving altogether. When they discouraged friends from visiting because it was too much stimulation. My world began shrinking room by room, decision by decision. I noticed doors being closed that used to stay open. Conversations stopping when I entered the room. My name being used in plans I hadn't agreed to. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself families go through adjustments. That recovery was hard on everyone. But deep down, something felt wrong. I wasn't being cared for. I was being managed. And once I noticed that difference, I couldn't unsee it. The first payment I missed wasn't intentional. My pension check usually arrived on the first Monday of the month. That time, it was delayed. Just a few days, but when I mentioned it, Daniel reacted sharply. "You didn't tell us you were short," he said. "I wasn't short," I replied. "It's just late." He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "We'll handle it." From that point on, I stopped seeing my bank statements. Daniel suggested consolidating my accounts to simplify things. Laura offered to keep track of expenses. They framed everything as concern, as efficiency. But each change moved something further out of my reach. My checkbook disappeared. My mail started being sorted before I saw it. Important letters were explained to me instead of shown. When I asked to review the numbers, Daniel sighed. "Mom, this is stressful for you," he said. "Why don't you trust us?" Trust. It became the word they used whenever I pushed back. I began noticing unfamiliar charges, contractors I hadn't approved, appliances I hadn't chosen. When I asked, Laura told me they were investments for the family. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. "If we're already paying everything," Daniel said, "it's basically ours." Laura replied, "We just need to make it official at some point." They fell silent when they realized I was listening. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my room, the same room I'd slept in for over 30 years, and wondered when it had started to feel temporary. A week later, Daniel brought me documents to sign. "Just power of attorney," he said casually. "In case of emergencies." I told him I wanted to have a lawyer look at them. His face hardened. "Why?" he asked. "Don't you trust your own children?" "I trust you," I said carefully. "But I also trust professionals." The argument that followed was unlike anything before. Not loud, but cold. Laura accused me of being paranoid. Daniel said I was ungrateful. They both said I was forgetting how much they'd done for me. By the end of it, I was exhausted. And that was the point. A few days later, I noticed something small, but chilling. My house keys didn't work smoothly anymore. At first, I told myself the lock was old. But deep down, I felt it. Something fundamental had shifted. And for the first time, I wondered whether the house I paid for, the house with my name on the deed, was no longer mine in any way that mattered. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had gone to a medical appointment across town, nothing urgent, just a routine follow-up. When the transport service dropped me off back home, the sun was already starting to set. The house looked the same as always. Lights on in the living room. Daniel's car in the driveway. Laura's voice faintly audible through an open window upstairs. I felt relieved. I rolled up to the front door, reached into my bag, and took out my keys. They didn't work. I tried again. Slower this time. Nothing. I checked the keyring, wondering if I'd grabbed the wrong one. I hadn't. These were the same keys I'd carried for decades. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Footsteps approached the door from inside. I heard the deadbolt turn, but the door only opened a few inches, held firmly by the chain. Daniel looked at me through the gap. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I live here," I said, confused. "Why isn't the door opening?" He hesitated, then said something that made my stomach drop. "We changed the locks." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. Laura appeared behind him. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "You didn't tell me," I said. "Why would you change the locks without telling me?" Daniel sighed, as if I were the problem. "Mom, this is for your safety," he said. "You keep losing things." We were worried. I didn't lose my keys, I replied. You took them. That's not how this works anymore, he said quietly. Those words landed harder than the locked door. I asked to be let inside. He told me to wait. I sat there, outside my own home, watching the light fade from the windows. Neighbors walked past and smiled politely, unaware that I was no longer welcome inside the house I had paid for. After several minutes, Daniel finally unchained the door and allowed me in, but not before taking my bag and checking it. I felt something crack inside me. That night, I stayed in my room with the door closed, listening to their voices downstairs. They spoke freely now, as if I weren't there at all. That was when the truth became impossible to ignore. I wasn't being helped. I wasn't being protected. I was being shut out. And if I didn't act soon, I knew the next time I was locked out, the door might never open again. The second time it happened, there was no chain. No hesitation. No explanation. I had spent the night at a friend's apartment after a doctor's appointment ran late. The next morning, when she drove me home, something felt wrong the moment we turned onto my street. Daniel's car was gone. So was Laura's. The driveway was empty. When I reached the front door, my keys didn't work again. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked harder, my heart beginning to race. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the paper taped to the door. It wasn't a letter. Just a note. We think it's best if you stay somewhere else for now. This situation has become too stressful for everyone. No signature. No apology. I sat there in my wheelchair, staring at the door I had opened thousands of times in my life, realizing I was no longer allowed inside. My friend offered to call the police. I said no. Not because I didn't need help, but because I was still trying to understand how my own children had done this without even speaking to me. I called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. I called Laura. She answered, but only long enough to say, "We're doing what's best," before hanging up. That was the moment something shifted inside me. The fear was still there. The shock too. But underneath it all, something else surfaced. Clarity. I wasn't confused anymore. They hadn't misunderstood me. They hadn't made a mistake. They had made a decision. And that decision was to take everything they could, while convincing me I deserved none of it. I spent that night in a small guest room at my friend's place, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment I'd ignored my instincts. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't speak up now, I would lose more than my house. I would lose my voice completely. And that was something I was no longer willing to give away. 2 days after being locked out, I met with an attorney. I brought every document I still had: old tax records, bank statements, insurance letters. My hands shook as I laid them out across his desk, half expecting him to tell me it was too late. He didn't. Instead, he looked at me and said something I hadn't heard in a long time. "This house is legally yours." Those words felt unreal. He explained that changing the locks without my consent was illegal. That controlling my finances without authorization crossed serious legal lines. That my children had no right, none, to remove me from my own property. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. With legal support, I returned to the house the following week, this time with a sheriff present. Daniel's face drained of color when he saw us. Laura started crying, insisting they had only been trying to help. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched as the locks were changed back, this time in my favor. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Within days, my children moved out. They left behind furniture, boxes, and years of entitlement. What they didn't leave behind was an apology. That came much later. And it was brief. Rebuilding my life took time. I changed banks. I reclaimed my accounts. I updated my will. I learned to ask questions again and to trust my answers. The house is mine now in every sense. Not just on paper, but in spirit. I live alone again, with help when I choose it. Friends visit freely. My door opens when I want it to and stays closed when I don't. I still think about how easily it all happened. How help turned into control. How silence turned into surrender. I'm telling this story because elder abuse doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people you raised. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, please listen to that feeling. Ask questions. Keep your documents. Protect your independence. It's not selfish. It's survival. And at 72 years old, I finally understand this. Losing your voice happens quietly. Getting it back takes courage. I got mine back.